Question number 4. What percentage of cases has a score between 71.7 and 90.6? So this appears to be similar to the first questions. And again, we draw this diagrams and show what we get from the question. And here is that we have this distribution. Here is the mean. Then we have this the whole big interval with the lower bound and upper bound. But this appear to be asymmetrical interval. Okay. Because between 78 and 71.7 is a lot shorter than between 78 and 90.6. Okay. So this question obviously asks us the size of this entire interval, and what we can do is to first find out the size of this orange interval, okay, between 71.7 and 78. Then we find the size of this green interval between 90.6 and 78. Now we put two slices together to obtain the size of the entire interval. Now, how do we find the size from 71.7 to 78? Again, we need to first figure out between 71.7 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. And to determine that, we need to again use the same methods that we have learned so far. 71.7 minus 78 divided by standard deviation, that gives us a -1. So we know that 71.7 is one standard deviation below the mean. Looking at this chart, one standard deviation below the mean, and you have this 34.13%. Therefore, we know that for the orange area, it is 34.13%. Then we have to determine the size of the green area. For that purpose, we have to determine 90.6 is how many standard deviation above the mean. And we use this formula to calculate that 90.6 minus 78 divided by 6.3. And that gives us a positive 2. So that tells us 90.6 is 2 standard deviation above the mean. And based upon this chart, that should be the size of the green area should be 34.13 plus 13.59. So the size of the green area has to be 47.72%, or half of the 95.44%. Now for the entire interval, this asymmetrical interval, you put the two slices together to obtain the size. Okay. So for the entire interval is the combinations of 34.13% and 47.72%, which gave us 81.85%. Question number 5. Between what two scores do the middle 95.44% of observations fall? So this question is really similar to the first question. The first question asks us what are the two scores, between what two scores do the middle 68.26% cases fall. But this question tells us between what two values do the middle 95.44% cases fall. Okay, let's first draw this diagram such as this. Understand the question. Obviously, this question asks us to give us this condition that between the interval bounded by two values, x1 and x2, the size of the interval is 95.44%, then what are the value of the lower bound and upper bound? So this is what we have to find out. To find out this, we need to find out x1 is how many standard deviation below the mean, and the x2 is how many standard deviation above the mean. And we know that 95.44% correspond to two standard deviation below the mean and above the mean. And obviously, we already know that x1 must be two standard deviation below the mean, and x22 must be two standard deviation above the mean. So this percentage number give us a clear clue regarding how many standard deviation of x1 is below the mean, and how many standard deviations x2 is above the mean. And based on those clues, we can calculate the actual value of x1 and x2. Now let's do that. Since we know that x1 is two standard deviation below the mean, and this is how we calculate that. The mean minus 2 times standard deviation. Here minus, you use a minus when this value is below the mean. Okay, so mean minus 2 times standard deviation. So 78 minus 2 times 6.3. So 78 minus 12.6, that gave us 65.4. So 65.4 correspond to a value here, which is 2 standard deviation below the mean. We also know that x2 is 2 standard deviation above the mean. Okay. So we calculate the actual value by using the mean plus 2 times standard deviation. Why is it plus? Because it is above the mean. Okay. So that gives us 78 plus 2 times 6.3. 78 plus 12.6 give us 90.6. So now these two values, 65.4 correspond to x1, 90.6 correspond to x2. These are the value of 2 standard deviation below the mean, 2 standard deviation above the mean. And these are the two values that the question is asking us to find out. Okay. So we're based upon this percentage as a clue, we figure out that x1 must be 2 standard deviation below the mean, x2 must be 2 standard deviation above the mean. Then we follow through this calculation to obtain the actual values of x1 and x2. Question number 6. What percentage of cases falls beyond 71.7? Now let's draw a little diagram to understand what question is asking. The mean of the distribution is 78, and the question gives us value 71.7, which is smaller than 78. So you must draw 71.7 to the left of 78. After that, you look at the question, what percentage of cases fall beyond 71.7? Beyond obviously means that those cases had to have values larger than 71.7 here. For all these cases that are larger than 71.7, what percentage are there for as constitute what the percentage of the entire distribution? So that is the size of this big corner. This big corner is formed by two sections. One is this slice, the other is the half of the distribution. Okay. Now, let's first figure out the size of this slice. First figure out what percentage of cases lie between 71.7 and 78. To figure that out, we need to figure out between 71.7 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. Again, we use here we just reinstate this question. We need to figure out this big percentage here. Now, to figure out what how many standard deviations are between 71.7 and 78, we use 71.7 minus 78 divided by 6.3 and give us -1. So we know that 71.7 is one standard deviation below the mean, and that number corresponds to this position. And between this position and the mean in the middle, you have 34.13% of cases. So we know that the size of this slice is 34.13%. But we're not done yet, because we need to know the size of the entire big corner, this whole colored area. But now we know the size of only a portion of it. We know this slice. What about this? What about this? The size of this area. What is the size of this area? I think some of you already know. Based upon the characteristic of normal distribution, this is a symmetrical distribution. So this is a half of the distribution. So this must be 50%. This must be 50% because this is a symmetrical distribution. So you have we know the size of this area. We know the size of this area automatically. Therefore, all we need to do now is put these two areas together to find out the size of the entire colored area. And that exactly what gives us the final answer to the question. The entire area is 34.13% plus 50% and 84.13%. Question number 7. Between what two numbers are the middle 99.74% of observations? So this is similar to two of the previous questions, which ask us between what two values are the middle 68.26% or the middle 95.44%. Okay, but this question is the middle 99.74%. We first draw diagrams. We know that in this diagram, in this colored area, the percentage of cases is 99.74%. And then from this chart, we realize that if you have the 99.74% in the middle, then you must have this interval bounded by 3 standard deviation below the mean and 3 standard deviation above the mean. In other words, x1 must be 3 standard deviation below the mean, and x2 must be 3 standard deviation above the mean. The question asks us what are the actual values of x1 and x2. And we just find out, we need to figure out how do we calculate the actual value of x1 and actual value of x2. What we know here is that x1 is 3 standard deviation below the mean, and that makes us to do this calculation. x1 is mean minus 3 times standard deviation. Again, why is minus? Because it is below the mean. y is 3 times standard deviation, we know that x1 is 3 standard deviation below the mean. So that's why we use the mean minus 3 times standard deviation. That is 78 minus 3 times 6.3, 78 minus 18.9. That gives us 59.1. Similarly, we know that x2 is 3 standard deviation above the mean, so the actual value of x2 is calculated using the mean plus 3 times standard deviation, plus, because x2 is above the mean, 3 times standard deviation, because we know x2 is 3 standard deviation above the mean. So that means 78 plus 3 times 6.3, or 78 plus 18.9. That gives us 96.9. So these two values are actually give us the value of x1 and x2. So again, we use clues. We use characteristics of normal distribution and give us help us to find out the answer to this question. Question number 8: what percentage of observations fall below 84.3? Let's draw this diagram such as this. 84.3 is larger than 78, larger than the mean, so that's why we draw 84.3 to the right of 78. And the percentage of cases fall below 84.3, all these values are lower than 84.3, so they are all below 84.3. So we need to find out the size of this orange area. This is kind of similar to an earlier questions where we need to find out a big corner to the right of 71.7, but now we need to find out the size of this corner to the left of 84.3. Okay, it's similar to an earlier question, but in opposite direction. Again, this whole area is formed by a combination of two areas, by this slice from 78 to 84.3 and the half of the distribution. Okay. So we need to first figure out the size of this slice. For that purpose, we need to figure out between 84.3 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. And for that purpose, we just use 84.3 minus 78 divided by 6.3. That gives us positive 1. That tells us 84.3 is 1 standard deviation above the mean. Therefore, the size of this slice must be 34.13. After that, we know the size of this area is simply the half of the distribution, 50%. So the entire area is simply the combination of 50% and 34.13%. So it's 84.13%. So in this in-class activity, we really demonstrate how we use characteristics of normal distribution to help us to do some simple calculations that relate to normal distribution. I hope this helps. I see you next time. Goodbye.